The Likachon doll is a Japanese urban legend about a cute doll that is rumored to be cursed. The Likachon doll is a very popular doll in Japan. It is the Japanese equivalent of the Barbie doll. In fact, it was so popular that the company that manufactures the dolls decided to set up a phone line to promote their product. Kids were able to call up and speak to Likachon. Actually, they just listened to a recorded message, but rumors began to spread that some kids had heard Likachon saying creepy things like, "I'm coming to your house to kill you." This gave rise to the following urban legend. One day, a young girl was cleaning up her room. Going through her possessions, she found a Likachon doll she had cherished when she was a child. However, she had gotten too old to play with dolls, so she took it outside and threw it in the trash. Sometime later, the girl and her parents moved to a new city. One day, she came home from school as usual. Her parents were still at work. As soon as she came through the front door, the phone in the hallway began to ring. When she picked it up, she heard a little voice say, "Hello, this is Likachon. I'm on the rubbish dump. I was abandoned, but I'm coming home." The young girl hung up the phone, thinking someone was playing a joke on her. A little later, the phone rang again. When she picked it up, the same voice said, "Hello, this is Likachon. I'm at the train station. Soon we'll be together again." She hung up and began to feel a little uneasy. After a while, the phone rang again. When she picked it up, the same voice said, "Hello, this is Likachon. I'm coming down your street. Do you miss me?" The girl hung up again. This time, she was scared. She wondered when her parents would get home. Of course, a few minutes afterwards, the phone rang yet again. The little girl heard the voice saying, "Hello, this is Likachon. I'm outside your house. Open the door." Now the girl was terrified and she kept saying to herself, "Surely it's just a joke." She went over to the window and peered through the curtains, but there was nothing outside. The girl was relieved. The phone rang one last time, and when she picked it up, she heard, "Hello, this is Likachon and I'm right behind you." Three-legged Likachon. According to the legend, the company that makes Likachon dolls had a fault in the manufacturing process. They accidentally produced a batch of doll with 3 legs. The dolls had already been shipped out to stores before the error was discovered. Although the company hurriedly recalled all the 3-legged dolls, some were not recovered and were sold to members of the public. One evening, a young woman was taking a walk in the park. She needed to go to the bathroom, so she walked into the public toilet and entered a cubicle. As she was sitting down on the toilet, she noticed something lying on the floor by her feet. It was a Likachon doll. She wondered what it was doing in such a place. Had somebody thrown it away? She felt sorry for the doll and casually picked it up. She was shocked by what she saw. The Likachon doll had 3 legs. 2 of the legs were normal and flesh-colored, but the 3rd leg was deformed and hairy and the color was a creepy purple. She was so startled at the sight that she accidentally dropped the doll. It lay face down on the floor of the bathroom. Then, as the young woman watched in horror, the doll's head slowly turned around to face her. It opened its tiny mouth and said, "My name is Likachon and I'm cursed. I'm cursed. I'm cursed." The woman was terrified and ran away from there as fast as she could. But wherever she went, the voice followed her and continued to whisper in her ear, "My name is Likachon and I'm cursed. I'm cursed. I'm cursed." The woman's phone kept ringing and the Likachon doll would be on the other end saying, "My name is Likachon and I'm cursed. I'm cursed. I'm cursed." Finally, the young woman could not bear it any longer and it drove her insane. She ruptured her own eardrums, just so she wouldn't have to hear the voice again. There are other stories associated with the 3-legged Likachon dolls. Sometimes one appears in the toilet of a school and is found by a young schoolgirl. It says, "My name is Likachon. Let's play a game of hide and seek." Before the schoolgirl has a chance to answer, the doll takes out a knife and stabs her, saying, "You're it." In another story, the doll's 3rd leg is made of human flesh and it says, "My name is Likachon and I'm looking for the owner of this leg." A different version involves a girl finding the Likachon doll in the toilet bowl. She is disgusted by the gross purple leg and tries to flush it down the toilet. A few days later, the girl gets into an accident and her leg has to be amputated. As she lies in hospital recovering, she looks down at her stump and discovers, to her horror, that a weird purple leg is growing there. Eventually, the leg takes over her entire body and kills her. Yet another tale has the three-legged Likachon appearing by your bedside while you are sleeping at night. She holds a butcher knife in her hand and waits for you to notice her. When you do, she attacks you and cuts off your legs with the knife. One cold, windy night, just at the end of autumn, Old Man Jenkins set off for a midnight stroll in the cemetery. The moon was full that night, just the way Old Man Jenkins liked it, because he could see the white bones dancing in the light. He walked from his house down a shadowy path that led to the old cemetery where people from town had been buried for the last 200 years. There were some new bones in that graveyard, but most of them were old. Old Man Jenkins walked straight through the wrought iron gates of the cemetery. The crumbling tombstones looked ghostly and foreboding in the moonlight. He walked to the middle of the graveyard and stopped. He listened to the wind whistling through the trees. Rise up, he shouted. Rise up, bloody bones, and shake. And all around him in the graveyard, the old, dusty bones in their graves began to stir. Rise up, bloody bones, he said again, even louder. And the old bones sat up and then stood up and then rose out of their graves. Rise up and shake, Old Man Jenkins said in his powerful voice. Those old bloody bones rose up and began to shake all around Old Man Jenkins in the moonlight. The wind blew them around and made their bony hands claw at the air and their feet dance on the soggy ground of the cemetery. Old Man Jenkins stood where he was, never moving. He felt big and strong, making those old bones shake like that. Rise up and shake, bloody bones. Old Man Jenkins said again, just so he could hear the sound of his own voice. The bony skeletons seemed to jump in the air at his command, and they shook even more. Finally, Old Man Jenkins had had enough, and he let the old bones crawl back into their graves to rest. He started to walk back out of the graveyard toward home when he stumbled over an old skull and fell down. Old Man Jenkins picked himself up, brushed off his clothes, and looked down at the skull. It was staring right back at him, its old teeth grinning in the moonlight. Old Man Jenkins went from one house to the next, pounding on the doors and telling everybody that he had found the skull that talked. The people got dressed and came out of their houses, grouchy and rubbing their eyes. They all thought Old Man Jenkins that he was just telling another one of his lies, but he insisted that he was telling the truth. All they had to do was follow him to the graveyard, and he'd show them the skull that talked. Listen, I guarantee you I'm not lying, Old Man Jenkins said. And I promise you that, if that skull doesn't talk, you can lock me in the graveyard all night. Most of the people just laughed at what Old Man Jenkins said, but one man, who didn't like him at all, went and got a big, strong padlock from his house. He brought it along with him as the group of townspeople followed Old Man Jenkins to the graveyard in the windy, cold night. As they came near the tall, wrought iron gates of the cemetery, Old Man Jenkins could see the skull lying on the path just inside the graveyard. He walked up to it while the rest of the people gathered around the gates. Old Man Jenkins looked down at the skull and said in his loudest, most powerful voice, "Talk." But the skull just lay there on the path and grinned up at him. He gave it a hard kick. It bounced over closer to where the people were standing. But the skull just stared back up at him and grinned. The townspeople began muttering to each other in angry voices. It bounced high in the air and landed not far away from the man with the padlock. The townspeople were getting impatient. They were tired and weary, and the wind was cutting through them like a knife. Eventually, they had enough of Old Man Jenkins and his lies. They slammed the high, wrought iron gates of the graveyard shut, locked them tight, and headed back home. Old Man Jenkins heard the creaking of the gates as they closed. He ran over, grabbed hold of the bars, and began to shake them. He started yelling at the people to let him out, but they couldn't hear him. The sound of the wind blowing through the trees was so loud that it drowned out his cries. And then, Old Man Jenkins heard a voice behind him. A low, gravelly voice. A voice that sounded like it had clawed its way up out of the grave. Rise up, it croaked. Rise up and dance. Old Man Jenkins felt his body begin to shake. He couldn't control himself. His limbs flailed wildly and he started dance. He shook himself back and forth, to and fro. He shook himself all night as the icy wind blew around him. He shook himself in the lonely graveyard as the skeletons watched in the moonlight. He shook himself all night until he finally danced himself to death. Hold Him, Tabbed is a ghost story about a man named Tab who spends the night in a spooky haunted house in Virginia. Before the railroads were built in Virginia, a lot of men would earn a living carrying supplies from one town to another on wagons. One cold afternoon, in late December, a number of supply wagons were traveling together when they were caught in a snowstorm. They came to an abandoned farm very near the road and decided that it would be a good place to sit out the storm. There were stalls for their horses and an old house where they could stay the night. As they were unhooking their horses, one of the men said he had heard some strange rumors about the old place. According to the stories he had been told, the house was haunted and not a single person who stayed the night in it had come out alive for 25 years. Some other men said they had heard the same stories and they refused to stay there. When the rest of the men heard this, they immediately decided to spend the night in the stables with their horses. One of men, whose name was Tab, was bigger and braver than the rest. He said he wasn't afraid of ghosts and that he wasn't about to stay out in the freezing cold with the animals when he could easily spend the night warm and cozy indoors. So that night, Tab stayed in the house while the others bedded down in the stables. Inside, Tab built a big fire in the stove and cooked himself some supper. When he was full, he lay down on a couch and slept peacefully through the night without being disturbed. At dawn, Tab awoke and opened a window and shouted out to his friends. "What a bunch of fools you guys are," he said. "You spent the night out in the cold when you could have stayed in here and been as warm and comfortable as me." Just as he had finished speaking, he happened to look up at the ceiling, and he saw there was a large man dressed in white clothes just stretched out under the roof as if he was sticking to it. Before Tab could make a move, the man in white fell right down upon him, and suddenly, they started tussling and fighting. They rolled back and forth across the floor, knocking the furniture out of their way. They made so much noise that the men in the stables heard it and ran to see what was going on. When they looked in the window, the men saw the struggle going on, but they were too scared to go inside. First, Tab was on top, and then the man in white would gain the upper hand. It was a fierce fight. One of the men cried out, "Hold him, Tab. Hold him." "You can bet your soul I will," yelled Tab. A minute later, the man in white grabbed Tab and dragged him out the window. "Hold him, Tab. Hold him," another man shouted. "You can bet your life I will," cried Tab. "He won't get away from me." Soon, the man in white had dragged Tab up onto the roof of the house. "Hold him, Tab. Hold him," yelled the men. "You can bet your boots I will," shouted Tab. "I've got him right where I want him." Finally, the man in white got Tab off the roof and the two were floating up into the air. "Hold him, Tab. Hold him," the men bellowed. "I've got him," screamed Tab. "But he's got me too." The ghost carried Tab straight up into the air until they were both out of sight. Nothing was ever seen of him again. The Hairy Woman is a story about a man who encounters a female Bigfoot. Once upon a time, a man was out hunting in the wilderness. He got lost and was wandering about aimlessly, unable to find his way home. He wandered for days and days until he was so weak and hungry he couldn't walk any longer. It was growing dark. Night was falling. It began to get very cold. The man noticed a big hole in the rocks. It was a deep, dark cave and he crawled inside to get warm. He gathered some leaves for a pillow, then curled up in a corner of the cave and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, he was awoken by a strange noise. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cave. The man sat up and listened. He heard a loud chomp, chomp, chomp as if something was chewing on something. The man turned on his flashlight and was shocked to see a huge hairy woman crouching there. She was completely naked and her body was covered from head to toe in dark hair. She was munching on the carcass of a large deer, pulling off the legs, tearing off the meat, and eating it raw. The man was afraid at first, but the hairy woman didn't attack him. She just continued eating. After a while, she tore a leg off the deer and offered it to him. The man was very hungry, so he nervously accepted it. He got up, collected some dry sticks, and built a small fire at the mouth of the cave. Then, he roasted the meat over the fire until it was cooked and ate it. The man stayed in the cave with the hairy woman for a few more days. She would go out hunting and come back with a deer carcass. She dug into the deer's hide with her big long fingernails and skinned it. Then, she tore the carcass to pieces with her powerful hands. The man would take the big pieces of deer meat and roast them over a fire. After several days, the hairy woman learned how to roast the meat herself. She got so used to eating roasted meat that she wouldn't eat it raw anymore. The man stayed in the cave through the winter. The hairy woman got pregnant and gave birth to a little baby boy. One side of it was hairy and the other side was normal. One time, after the hairy woman left to go hunting, the man followed her to see what she was doing. He went out to the edge of the cliff and looked down. He saw 2 or 3 dozen hairy people coming up the hill. The hairy woman was pushing them back. They wanted to see what was in the cave and she wouldn't let them. The man was scared to death. He was afraid the hairy people were going to kill him. The hairy woman made them go back down the mountain and the man was very relieved. Eventually, the man decided he had to leave the cave and go back home. He began to build a small boat that would be able to take him down the river. When his boat was ready, the man didn't tell the hairy woman he was going to leave. He just ran down to the water's edge, jumped into the boat, and set sail. As he was drifting away, the hairy woman came running. She was clutching her child in her arms. She started crying and hollering, wanting him to stay. "No, I'm tired of living in a cave," the man said. "I'm going back to civilization again." When she realized he was leaving for good, the hairy woman grabbed the child, tore it in half, and threw the hairy part at him. The man sailed on and left the hairy woman standing there, clutching the other half of her child. Tiger Eyes is a scary story about a wild animal that impersonates a man. Many years ago, there was a man who lived in Laos. One day, the man took his gun and went out hunting for food. He didn't realize that a tiger was stalking him. The man spotted a monkey in a tree. As he raised his gun and took aim, the tiger was watching and waiting. The man shot the monkey and it fell out of the tree. As the man bent down to pick up the monkey's body, the tiger saw an opportunity. It attacked, pouncing on the man and killing him. The tiger dragged the man's body back to its cave. It took a sharp knife and began skinning the man's corpse. Then, it cooked his body parts over a fire and ate them, but it still wasn't satisfied. The tiger had an idea. It crawled into the man's skin. Then, it put on the man's clothes, slung the man's gun over its shoulder, and said, "Now, I am a man." Back at the man's house, his wife was waiting for him to return. She was busy preparing to cook dinner, chopping up the vegetables and washing the rice. Her younger sister, Yer, who lived with them, was taking care of the children. Just then, they heard the front door open and the man walked in. He gave a dead monkey to his wife and told her to cook it. Then, he sat down at the table and waited. His wife didn't pay any attention to him, but Yer was suspicious. "There's something wrong," she whispered to her older sister. "That's not your husband. He looks like your husband, but his eyes are different. He has tiger eyes." The wife laughed. "You're always imagining things, Yer," she said. The wife chopped the monkey into 6 pieces and cooked it. When she put the meat down on the table, the man grabbed it and gobbled it down in a second, licking his lips hungrily. "That's not your husband," Yer whispered to her older sister. "He looks like your husband, but he eats like a tiger." The wife laughed. "Stop being silly, Yer," she said. That night, the wife and the children slept downstairs with the man. The younger sister, Yer, was frightened, so she slept up in the attic. During the night, Yer was awoken by a strange sound. She listened and heard a soft crunch, crunch, crunch like the breaking of bones. She was scared and called down, "What are you doing?" The tiger answered, "Oh, nothing, just chewing some plant stems with rice water." The next morning the tiger said, "Come down," but Yer was afraid and she wouldn't come down. The tiger said, "You come down or I'll come up." Yer huddled in the attic and began to cry. Then, she saw a pigeon land on the windowsill. She quickly wrote a message to her family on a piece of paper. Please help me. A tiger came during the night and ate everybody. I'm the only one left alive. I'm hiding in the attic, and I'm safe now, but I don't know for how long. Come quickly. She tied the message to the pigeon's leg and it flew off. Then the tiger came back from the river. Yer threw ashes and salt and pepper into his eyes. And he went back. Yer's older brothers finally arrived at the house. They were armed with spears and sabers and had come to save her. We got your message, they called up to her. Where's the tiger? Down at the river, answered Yer. I'll call him. Yer's brothers dug a hole in the path and covered it with sticks and leaves. Yer leaned up the attic window, cupped her hands over her mouth, and called out, Tiger, tiger, my family is here. They will give me to you. I will be your wife. Aha. Good. I'm coming right now, the tiger said as he hurried back to the house. The tiger ran up the path, and when it came to the hole covered with sticks and leaves, it fell in. Yer's brothers gathered around the hole and pressed their spears down into the tiger's belly until it was dead. Then, they rescued Yer from the attic and took her back to her village.